1944, somewhere over the South Pacific, Hank Marlowe lands with his parachute on an island after his plane crashes. Another soldier, Gunpei Ikari, lands. Marlowe draws his gun on Ikari and shoots but misses. Ikari takes out his gun and chases after Marlowe. They run into the forest and fight when they go by a cliff. Ikari nearly impales Marlowe with his sword, but Marlowe pulls it away. Ikari then has Marlowe on the ground and nearly kills him before a gigantic ape hand appears. The two men then see the ape rise above them. In 1973, in Washington, D.C., government official Bill Ronda and geologist Houston Brooks arrived to meet with Senator Willis to receive funding for an expedition to a recently discovered location called Skull Island. Willis isn't too keen on the idea, but Ronda goads him into relenting. Before leaving, Ronda tells Willis he also would like a military escort. The Sky Devil squadron are gathered on their last day before they can finally go home. Led by Colonel Preston Packard, Packard receives the call for the expedition and gladly accepts the job. Ronda and Brooks go to a bar and find a former British Special Air Service captain named James Conrad to be their tracker. When he hears their offer, he demands more money and points out that there's a good chance that the trip will get them killed for reasons involving severe weather conditions or predatory creatures. Inside a darkroom, anti-war photographer Mason Weaver is developing some photos she took of the conflict in Vietnam. She gets a call to join the expedition, and she arrives at the base to meet with Packard and his men, plus a team of scientists from the company Landsat. The team sails into the ocean before taking choppers to the island. They must pass through clouds that produce hurricane-like conditions. After a turbulent ride through the storm, the choppers fly across the area. Weaver takes some pictures while the soldiers begin dropping seismic charges into the ground, setting off explosions. Almost immediately, a tree is thrown through one of the choppers, sending it crashing to the ground. The team then sees Kong towering over them. He sends another tree through a chopper before grabbing a few more and smashing them into the ground. The surviving team members are separated once they hit the ground. Packard confronts Ronda at gunpoint and demands to know what really brought them there. Ronda admits that he had known about the existence of monsters like Kong for a while, and he is seeking proof for his organization, Monarch. Conrad, Weaver, Brooks, Lynn, Slivko, and Neves are grouped together while Ronda, Packard, Mills, Cole, and other soldiers set out to look for Chapman, as he is equipped with enough ammunition that Packard intends to use against Kong. As the soldiers walk through a bamboo forest, one soldier suddenly stops. A bamboo tree has impaled him through the mouth. Above them is a giant spider that starts attacking them. Mills is pulled up by the webbing, and the rest of the soldiers start cutting its legs off. Mills cuts himself loose, and Packard shoots the spider to death. Chapman is by himself near a river. He sees Kong walking through the river to tend to a wound he sustained from the chopper's gunfire. Kong drinks from the river and then finds a giant octopus. He tangles with it, fighting off its tentacles before he starts to eat it. He then drags the octopus carcass away. James' group is cornered by a tribe of natives. As they try to defend themselves, out comes an older Marlowe. He assures both groups that they are not harmful to each other and then invites the group past the wall. Marlowe explains to the group that he's been there for the last 28 years and has learned a lot about the natives and the island itself. Kong is like a god to them, as he has been protecting them from the creatures that dwell beneath the earth and have been killing off the natives for centuries, as well as Kong's own family. Marlowe calls them skull crawlers. They stayed underground until the explosions from the seismic charges woke them up. If anything happens to Kong, the skull crawlers will dominate the island. He also suggests that the skull crawlers that have come to the surface are just juveniles, and that a much larger one exists. Still alone, Chapman walks through the forest and sits on a log. The log turns out to be a giant insect. Chapman shoots at it, but the creature does not retaliate. As the creature leaves, Chapman is killed by a skull crawler. James tells Marlowe that they plan to make it to their rendezvous point on the north side of the island within 3 days, so that they may be rescued. Marlowe says that it cannot be done in 3 days on foot, so he agrees to guide them the right way. He bids the natives farewell and takes the crew on a boat. Shortly after riding away, Neves is snatched up by carnivorous birds and torn apart midair. Marlowe leads the group into the Forbidden Zone, which is a former battleground between Kong's ancestors and the skull crawlers. A skull crawler appears, forcing the group to hide. The skull crawler then spits out Chapman's skull and dog tags, which James notices. Packard and his men come around the same area. Ronda is taking pictures and is then snatched up and eaten by a skull crawler. Another beast shows up and starts to attack and pull victims in with its tongue. The groups continue their battle with the skull crawlers, plus a wave of the carnivorous birds. Marlowe takes out the sword that belonged to Akari and slashes through several of the birds before handing it over to James. Weaver kills one by tossing a lighter into a hole that produces fumes, which are ignited and set the creature on fire. After the fight, they regroup. Packard is still set on looking for Chapman. James shows Packard Chapman's dog tags to confirm his demise. Still, Packard wants to look for Chapman's ammunition stash so that they can kill Kong. He is hellbent on revenge for the deaths of his men, despite the objections of Marlowe, James, and Weaver. That night, Packard gathers explosives and lays a trap for Kong. Packard lures Kong toward him and ignites the fuel along the water, singeing and burning Kong's fur. Kong stomps on Steve and kills another man in the chaos before collapsing. Packard then gets ready to set off some explosives, but James and Weaver try to stop him. They convince the other soldiers that they need Kong to keep the skull crawlers out. The soldiers turn on Packard, who remains defiant. Just then, the biggest skull crawler bursts out of the ground, forcing the group to run. Packard stays behind to detonate the explosives, but Kong crushes him under his fist. The survivors then head toward the shore as the main skull crawler pursues them. Cole stays behind to sacrifice himself with the explosive devices he has strapped to himself. However, the monster tail whips Cole into a wall, and he blows up anyway. The skull crawler heads toward the group until Kong returns and smashes into the beast. Kong uses a ship's propeller attached to a length of anchor chain to wood the beast, finally slashing it on the throat. The beast isn't dead and attacks again. Kong grabs the skull crawler and hurls him into the wall, accidentally knocking Weaver into the river. Kong pulls Weaver out and still fights the skull crawler. He rams his fist down the monster's throat and pulls out its guts. Kong then places Weaver down next to James before leaving. Shortly after, the survivors depart on the boat, and 3 choppers show up to get them. In the distance, Kong keeps a lookout to continue protecting his territory. He pounds his fist and lets out a roar. As the credits begin, we see video footage of Marlowe finally returning home to Chicago, where he sees his wife again and finally meets his adult son. After the credits, James and Weaver are being held in an interrogation room by Monarch. Entering the room are Brooks and Lynn, who tell the two that Kong was never the only monster out there and that this world did not always belong to humankind. Brooks pulls out some files, including a map of Tokyo, before putting on a slideshow. The slides show another crew coming across cave drawings of other monsters: Mothra, King Ghidorah, Rodan, and Godzilla himself.